The metal detector screamed at Millbrook Correctional Facility at exactly 2:47 p.m. on a cold Tuesday afternoon. Ma'am. Please step aside. The guard's voice cut through the air like a blade. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not today. Not when Marcus was so close to his release date. Sarah's trembling fingers clutched the small package hidden beneath her coat. Inside that innocent-looking box lay the key to everything they had planned. The key to Marcus's freedom. But also, unknowingly, the key to her own destruction. You see, love makes us do unthinkable things. It blinds us to consequences. It whispers lies that sound like truth. And sometimes, just sometimes, it leads us down a path so dark that there's no way back to the light. Sarah thought she was saving the man she loved. She believed their fairy tale would have a happy ending. She never imagined that in 3 hours, Marcus would be gone. Not just from prison, gone from her life forever. Leaving behind nothing but tire tracks on a dusty highway and a heart shattered into a million irreparable pieces. What happened next would make headlines across the state. It would destroy families, end careers, and prove that sometimes the people we trust most are the ones capable of the deepest betrayal. The guard stepped closer, his hand moving instinctively toward his radio. Sarah's mouth went dry. Every second felt like an eternity. In the distance, she could see Marcus through the reinforced glass, his dark eyes fixed on her with an intensity that used to make her feel safe. Now, it felt like staring into the eyes of a stranger. Ma'am, I need you to remove your coat. The words echoed in the sterile room. Other visitors shifted uncomfortably in their plastic chairs. Children stopped coloring. Conversations died mid-sentence. Everyone was watching the drama unfold. Sarah's mind raced. If she got caught now, everything would be over. Marcus would serve his full sentence. Worse, she'd be facing charges herself. But if she walked away now, if she abandoned the plan, would Marcus ever forgive her? The irony wasn't lost on her. She was about to become a criminal to free a criminal. She was about to throw away her clean record, her teaching career, her entire future for a man who, though she didn't know it yet, was already planning to throw her away. I think there might be something wrong with the machine, Sarah stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm not carrying anything metal. The guard's eyes narrowed. He'd been working at Millbrook for 12 years. He'd seen every trick in the book. Desperate wives, loyal girlfriends, well-meaning mothers, they all had the same look when they were carrying contraband. That mixture of terror and determination. That wide-eyed innocence that screamed guilt. Stepped through again, slowly this time. Behind the glass, Marcus watched the scene unfold. His jaw was clenched, his hands balled into fists. To the casual observer, he looked like a concerned boyfriend worried about his girlfriend's embarrassment. But Marcus wasn't concerned about Sarah's embarrassment. He was concerned about his timeline. The escape was scheduled for tonight. His contact on the outside was already in position. The getaway car was fueled and ready. The fake IDs were printed. Everything hinged on Sarah getting that package through security. And if she failed, well, Marcus had contingency plans. He always did. The metal detector remained silent on Sarah's second pass. The guard frowned, tapping the side of the machine. Technology could be unreliable, especially the older models they used in state facilities. Budget cuts meant they were working with equipment that should have been replaced years ago. Must be a glitch, he muttered, waving Sarah through. She nearly collapsed with relief. Her legs felt like jelly as she made her way to the visiting area. Each step was a victory, each breath a small miracle. She had done it. She had actually done it as she sat down across from Marcus. Separated by the thick glass partition, she allowed herself a small smile. They were going to make it. In just a few hours, they would be together. Really, together. No more glass barriers. No more supervised phone calls. No more counting down the days until his release. Marcus picked up his phone, his eyes never leaving hers. When he spoke, his voice was warm, honey, sweet, and smooth. You're amazing, baby. I love you so much. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. I love you too. Are you ready for tonight? More ready than I've ever been for anything. He wasn't lying. Marcus was ready. He'd been planning this moment for months. Every detail had been considered, every variable accounted for. Every person had been assigned their role in his grand escape, including Sarah, especially Sarah. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that her role was almost over. Once he was free, once he had what he needed, Sarah Martinez would become a liability. A loose end that needed to be cut. The clock on the wall showed 3:15 p.m. In exactly 6 hours and 45 minutes, Marcus would be free. In 7 hours, he would steal a car from the parking lot of a 24-hour diner. And in 8 hours, he would disappear into the vast American wilderness, leaving behind a trail of broken promises and a woman whose only crime was loving him too much. But Sarah didn't know any of this yet. As she sat there, looking into the eyes of the man she thought she knew, she believed she was looking at her future, her forever. She had no idea she was staring at her destruction. To understand how Sarah Martinez ended up in that visiting room, risking everything for a man who would abandon her, you need to understand who she was before Marcus Taylor entered her life like a hurricane disguised as a gentle breeze. Sarah was 28 years old, a third-grade teacher at Lincoln Elementary in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. She lived in a small apartment above Mrs. Chun's bakery, where the smell of fresh bread drifted up through the floorboards every morning at 5 a.m. Her life was routine, predictable, safe. Some might have called it boring. Sarah called it peaceful. She drove the same route to work every day, ate lunch in the same corner of the teacher's lounge, and spent her evenings grading papers while old episodes of cooking shows played in the background. Her biggest excitement was the monthly book club meeting at the library, where she and 6 other women discussed romance novels over cheap wine and store-bought cookies. Sarah had never been arrested, never even gotten a speeding ticket. The most rebellious thing she'd ever done was return a library book 3 days late. She paid taxes early, never littered, and always used her turn signals. In other words, she was exactly the kind of person who should never have fallen in love with Marcus Taylor. But love doesn't follow logic. Love doesn't care about background checks or criminal records. Love simply shows up, uninvited and unwelcome, and changes everything in its path. Sarah met Marcus at the Cedar Rapids Community Center, where she volunteered teaching literacy classes to ex-offenders trying to reintegrate into society. It was a program she'd joined because her principal had suggested volunteer work would look good on her teaching evaluations. Sarah never expected to find anything there except a line on her resume. Marcus was different from the other students. While they struggled with basic reading comprehension, he devoured books like a man starved for knowledge. He read Steinbeck and Hemingway, discussed philosophy with the kind of depth that surprised even the program coordinators. Most people assume that being in prison makes you stupid, he told Sarah after their first class together. But you know what prison really does? It gives you time to think, time to read, time to become the person you always could have been. His voice was deep and smooth, with just a trace of a southern accent that hinted at roots somewhere far from Iowa. When he smiled, which he did often around Sarah, his whole face transformed. The hard lines around his eyes softened. The defensive set of his shoulders relaxed. Sarah found herself looking forward to Tuesdays and Thursdays, when Marcus attended her classes. She told herself it was because he was such an engaged student, so eager to learn. She pretended it had nothing to do with the way he looked at her, like she was the most fascinating person in the room. Marcus Taylor was 34 years old, serving a 7-year sentence for armed robbery at Millbrook Correctional Facility. What Sarah didn't know, what Marcus never told her, was that this wasn't his first conviction. He'd been in and out of the system since he was 18. Theft, assault, fraud, robbery, each sentence longer than the last. What she also didn't know was that Marcus had spent his time in prison learning, not just from books, but from other inmates. He'd learned how to read people, how to identify their weaknesses, how to become exactly what they needed him to be. With Sarah, he became the reformed man seeking redemption. The intellectual, trapped by circumstances beyond his control. The sensitive soul who wrote poetry in his cell and dreamed of a different life. It wasn't entirely an act. Marcus was intelligent, well-read, charismatic. But these qualities, in him, were tools rather than virtues. They were weapons he wielded with surgical precision. Their relationship developed slowly, carefully. Marcus never pushed. He let Sarah come to him, let her make the first moves, the first suggestions. When she offered to visit him at the prison, he seemed reluctant. "I don't want you to see me in there," he said during one of their classes. "You're this beautiful, pure thing, and that place, ... It's ugly, Sarah. It would change how you see me." Of course, this only made Sarah more determined. She saw his reluctance as nobility, his shame as proof of his reformation. She couldn't have known that Marcus had used these exact words with 3 other women during his incarceration. Couldn't have known that there was a script he followed. Refined through practice and repetition, Sarah began visiting Marcus twice a week. She drove the 43 miles to Millbrook every Saturday and Wednesday, spending her own money on gas, taking personal days when the visits conflicted with school schedules. She wrote him letters every night, long rambling accounts of her day, her thoughts, her dreams. Marcus wrote back, of course. Beautiful letters filled with poetry and philosophy, declarations of love, and promises of the future they would build. Together, Sarah kept every letter in a shoebox under her bed, reading them over and over until the paper grew soft from handling. She never questioned why Marcus never talked about his family. Never wondered why he had no other visitors besides her. Never asked about his life before prison. Accepting his vague references to mistakes and bad choices. Without pressing for details, love had made her incurious about the very things she should have questioned most. 6 months into their relationship, Marcus began mentioning his release date. Still 18 months away, but he talked about it constantly. About the apartment they would share, the jobs he would apply for, the life they would build together. "I'm going to be a different man when I get out," he promised her during one visit. "You've changed me, Sarah. You've shown me what love really means." Sarah believed him completely. She started saving money for their future apartment, researching job opportunities for ex-offenders, even looking into the process for legally changing her name after marriage. She never noticed that Marcus never asked about her dreams, her plans, her desires for their future. The conversations were always about what he wanted, what he needed, what he planned to do. Sarah had become so focused on supporting his dreams that she'd forgotten to have any of her own. 12 months into their relationship, with 6 months left on his sentence, Marcus made his request. It seemed almost casual, dropped into conversation. Like an afterthought. "The commissary prices are crazy," he mentioned during a phone call. "I can barely afford the basic stuff I need. And some of the guys in here, they're not happy that I've been getting special treatment from the guards because I'm in the education program." Sarah's heart clenched. "Are you safe? Are people threatening you?" "I can handle myself, baby, but it would be easier if I had a few things. Just small stuff, nothing major." The first request was innocent enough. A watch battery that had stopped working. Sarah smuggled it in without question, hidden in the binding of a book. It was easy, almost thrilling. She felt like a partner in their relationship rather than just a supporter. The second request was slightly bigger. A small screwdriver for Marcus to fix things in his cell, he said. Again, Sarah complied without hesitation. The third request raised a small flag in her mind. But she pushed her doubts aside. Marcus needed her, he was counting on her. And wasn't love about sacrifice? About doing difficult things for the people you care about? By the time Marcus asked her to bring in the package that would enable his escape, Sarah was so deep into the pattern of saying yes that saying no felt impossible. She'd already crossed so many lines, broken so many rules. What was one more? Besides, Marcus was going to be released in just 3 months anyway. They were simply speeding up the inevitable, right? They weren't really breaking the law, just bending it a little. Sarah had no idea that every request, every small favor, every boundary crossed, had been part of Marcus's plan from the very beginning. She was not his girlfriend, she was his mark, and she had played her role perfectly, as she sat across from Marcus in that visiting room. The contraband successfully delivered. Sarah felt proud of herself. She felt like a partner, a co-conspirator, a woman worthy of the great love Marcus claimed to feel for her. She had no idea that in Marcus's mind, she had just outlived her usefulness. 3. The perfect plan unfolds approximately equals 1,000 words. The package Sarah delivered contained 3 items, each no bigger than a smartphone, each critical to Marcus's escape plan. She didn't know what was inside. Marcus had sealed it carefully, telling her it was better if she didn't know the details. Plausible deniability, he'd called it with a reassuring smile. What Sarah had smuggled into Millbrook Correctional Facility was a small electronic device that could override the prison's aging security system, a master keycard cloned from a guard's access pass, and a cell phone loaded with GPS coordinates and contact information for his accomplices on the outside. Marcus had spent 2 years preparing for this moment. Not just the physical aspects of the escape, but the psychological groundwork needed to ensure success. Sarah wasn't his first choice for an accomplice. She was simply the most reliable, the most trusting, the most willing to ignore red flags in favor of romantic fantasies. At 9:45 p.m., long after visiting hours had ended and Sarah had driven home to her apartment above the bakery, Marcus put his plan into motion. The cell block was settling into its nighttime routine. Guards made their rounds every 20 minutes. Their footsteps echoing down the concrete corridors like a mechanical heartbeat, but Marcus lay on his narrow bunk, listening to the familiar sounds of institutional life, toilets flushing, televisions, murmuring through thin walls, the occasional shout from someone having a nightmare. He'd heard these sounds for 6 years, but tonight would be the last time, at exactly 10:17 p.m. During the gap between guard rotations, Marcus activated the electronic device Sarah had unknowingly delivered. The prison's security system, already struggling with budget cuts and deferred maintenance, couldn't handle the sophisticated override program. Camera feeds began looping previous footage. Door sensors showed closed when they were actually open. Motion detectors went blind. Marcus slipped out of his cell like a ghost, the cloned keycard granting him access to areas that should have been impossible to reach. He moved through the prison with the confidence of someone who belonged there, nodding to the few people he encountered as if he were simply heading to the library or the chapel. The beauty of Marcus's plan wasn't its complexity, it was its simplicity. He didn't need to scale walls or dig tunnels. He didn't need to overpower guards or start riots. He simply walked out the front door, using the same path visitors took every day. By 10:45 p.m. Marcus Taylor was no longer an inmate at Millbrook Correctional Facility. He was a free man standing in the parking lot, breathing unfiltered air for the first time in 6 years. A car was waiting for him exactly where it was supposed to be. Not a flashy sports car or a heavily modified getaway vehicle, but a 5-year-old Honda Accord, the kind of unremarkable vehicle that could disappear in traffic without drawing attention. "You're late," said the man behind the wheel. "I'm exactly on time," Marcus replied, sliding into the passenger seat. "Let's go." The driver was Tommy Reeves, a former cellmate who'd been released 18 months earlier. Tommy owed Marcus a favor, several favors, actually. Marcus had protected him during his first terrifying weeks in prison, when Tommy's babyface and nervous demeanor had made him a target for predators. Now Tommy was returning the favor. Though he wasn't entirely comfortable with the arrangement, he'd been trying to build a legitimate life since his release. He had a job at an auto parts store, a small apartment, a girlfriend who didn't know about his criminal past. "After tonight, we're even," Tommy said, as they pulled out of the parking lot. "I don't want any part of whatever you're planning next." Marcus smiled in the darkness. "After tonight, you'll never see me again." They drove in silence through the Iowa countryside, past farms and small towns where people were settling in for the night, unaware that a fugitive was passing through their peaceful communities. Marcus felt a familiar rush of adrenaline. The same feeling he'd experienced during his first robbery 20 years earlier. He was good at this, good at planning, good at executing, good at disappearing. Prison hadn't rehabilitated him, it had educated him. He'd learned from his mistakes, studied the failures of other inmates, absorbed lessons from every successful escape he'd heard about during his incarceration. At 11:30 p.m. they reached the rendezvous point, a 24-hour truck stop on Interstate 80, the kind of place where travelers came and went at all hours without anyone paying attention. The parking lot was full of semis and RVs, creating perfect cover for what Marcus needed to do next. "This is where I get out," Marcus said. Tommy looked nervous. "What about the car? They'll trace it back to me." "No, they won't." Marcus's voice was calm, matter-of-fact, "because you're going to report it stolen tomorrow morning. You'll tell the police you discovered it missing when you went to work. You'll seem appropriately upset. You'll cooperate fully with the investigation. And what if they don't believe me?" Marcus turned to look at Tommy, and for a moment, the mask slipped. Tommy saw something cold and predatory in his former protector's eyes, something that reminded him why Marcus had been feared even by hardened criminals. "They'll believe you," Marcus said softly, "because you're going to make them believe you, because your freedom depends on it, because disappointing me would be very, very unwise." Tommy swallowed hard and nodded. He watched Marcus get out of the car and disappear into the maze of parked vehicles, moving with the confidence of a man who owned the world. Within minutes, Marcus had found what he was looking for, a pickup truck with out-of-state plates, parked away from the main building where its owner was probably sleeping in the cab of his semi. The truck was old enough that its security system was easy to bypass, new enough that it would run reliably for hundreds of miles. Marcus had learned auto theft from some of the best in the business during his years behind bars. Theory and practice, combined with natural aptitude and desperate motivation. At 11:52 p.m., Marcus Taylor drove out of the truck stop parking lot in a stolen vehicle, heading west toward horizons that stretched endlessly under a star-filled sky. He felt free in a way he hadn't experienced since childhood. No walls, no schedules, no guards. Just open road and infinite possibilities. Behind him, he left a trail of betrayed trust and broken promises. Ahead of him lay a future limited only by his imagination and ruthless determination. He never once thought about Sarah. Sarah woke up at 5:17 a.m. to the sound of sirens. At first, she thought it was just another emergency vehicle heading to the hospital 3 blocks away. Living downtown meant she'd grown accustomed to the constant soundtrack of urban life. Ambulances, fire trucks, police cars rushing to handle other people's crises. But these sirens were different. They were coming from multiple directions, converging on a single point. And that point, Sarah realized with growing dread, was very close to her apartment. She stumbled to her window, still wearing the oversized t-shirt she'd fallen asleep in, and peered through the blinds. The street below was chaos. Police cars, their red and blue lights painting the buildings in alternating colors of urgency. Officers running, shouting into radios, neighbors emerging from their homes in robes and pajamas, forming small clusters of worried conversation. Sarah's phone rang, the shrill sound cutting through her confusion like a blade. She grabbed it without looking at the caller ID, expecting to hear Marcus's voice, maybe calling from the prison to explain what was happening. Sarah Martinez. The voice was official, impersonal. "Yes, this is Detective Rebecca Walsh with the Iowa Department of Criminal Investigation. I need you to come down to the station for questioning regarding the escape of Marcus Taylor from Millbrook Correctional Facility." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Escape. Marcus had escaped. This wasn't part of the plan. They were supposed to speed up his release, not this. "I don't understand," Sarah whispered. "Marcus is scheduled to be released in 3 months. Why would he escape?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Detective Walsh spoke again, her voice carried a note of something that might have been pity. "Miss Martinez, Marcus Taylor was never scheduled for release in 3 months. His earliest possible parole date was 7 years from now. He was serving a 25-year sentence for armed robbery, aggravated assault, and being a habitual offender. The phone slipped from Sarah's numb fingers, clattering to the floor. 25 years. Habitual offender. Everything Marcus had told her was a lie. Every promise, every plan, every declaration of love, all of it, built on deception so complete that Sarah felt like her entire reality was crumbling. She sank onto her bed, her mind racing to process this information. If Marcus was never getting out in 3 months, then what was the package really for? What had she helped him do? The answer was obvious, but Sarah's brain refused to accept it. She had helped a dangerous criminal escape from prison. She had become an accessory to a federal crime. Her teaching career was over. Her life as she knew it was over. But worse than the legal consequences was the emotional devastation. Marcus didn't love her. Had never loved her. She wasn't his girlfriend, she was his mark, his tool, his unwitting accomplice in a carefully orchestrated plan. Detective Walsh arrived at Sarah's apartment 20 minutes later, accompanied by 2 uniformed officers and a social worker. Sarah had gotten dressed by then, pulling on jeans and a sweater with shaking hands, trying to make herself look presentable for what she somehow knew would be the worst day of her life. Miss Martinez, Detective Walsh, was younger than Sarah. Had expected, probably early 30s, with kind eyes that couldn't quite hide the suspicion beneath. "We need to ask you some questions about your relationship with Marcus Taylor." Sarah sat at her small kitchen table, the same table where she'd written dozens of love letters to a man who had never existed. The irony wasn't lost on her, I thought. "I knew him," she said quietly. "I thought he was getting out soon. I thought we were going to build a life together." Detective Walsh opened a file folder, revealing photographs and documents that told the real story of Marcus Taylor. Police reports dating back 15 years, mugshots showing a progression from young man to hardened criminal. Victim statements describing a pattern of manipulation, theft, and violence. Marcus Taylor has been using women to facilitate his criminal activities for over a decade, the detective explained. "You're not the first, Miss Martinez. There was Jennifer in Ohio, who smuggled him money and cell phones during his 2015 incarceration. Maria in Texas, who provided him with a getaway car after his 2018 escape attempt. Rebecca, in Kansas, who stopped." Sarah's voice was barely audible. "Please stop," but Detective Walsh continued, her voice gentle but relentless. "Each woman thought she was special. Each woman believed Marcus loved her. Each woman was convinced she was helping the man of her dreams start a new life." Sarah felt physically sick. She ran to her bathroom and vomited until there was nothing left in her stomach but bile and betrayal. When she returned to the kitchen, Detective Walsh was waiting with a glass of water and a box of tissues. "What happens to me now?" Sarah asked. "That depends on several factors. Your cooperation with our investigation, for instance. The extent of your involvement in the escape. Whether you were a willing participant or a manipulated victim." The distinction felt meaningless to Sarah. Willing or manipulated, she had still committed crimes. She had still betrayed every principle she'd ever held dear. She had still destroyed her life for a man who saw her as nothing more than a useful fool. Over the next 6 hours, Sarah told the investigators everything, every visit, every letter, every package she'd smuggled into the prison. She held nothing back, partly because she wanted to help catch Marcus, but mostly because she no longer had the energy to protect herself. As she spoke, a clearer picture of Marcus's escape plan emerged. The electronic device had disabled security systems throughout the prison. The cloned keycard had given him access to restricted areas. The cell phone had connected him with accomplices on the outside. Sarah had been the perfect unwitting accomplice, trustworthy enough to get past security, naive enough to ask no questions, and disposable enough to abandon without a second thought. "Do you have any idea where he might have gone?" Detective Walsh asked. Sarah shook her head. "He talked about California sometimes. Said he'd always wanted to see the Pacific Ocean. But I don't know if that was true either. I don't know if anything he ever told me was true. The answer, Sarah would later learn, was no. Nothing Marcus had told her was true. Not his dreams, not his plans, not his feelings. Even his name was false. His real name was Michael Torres, and he had a warrant outstanding in 3 states. As Sarah sat in that interrogation room, staring at photos of the man she thought she loved, one truth became crystal clear. She had never known Marcus Taylor at all. She had fallen in love with a ghost. A carefully constructed fiction designed to exploit her deepest desires and vulnerabilities. And somewhere out there, the real Marcus was driving stolen vehicles through the American wilderness, already forgetting the woman who had sacrificed everything for a love that never existed. 3 days after Marcus's escape, the stolen pickup truck was found abandoned in a rest area outside Denver, Colorado. The vehicle had been wiped clean of fingerprints, but security footage from a nearby gas station showed a man matching Marcus's description, purchasing supplies and a baseball cap. Before disappearing into the Rocky Mountain wilderness, Sarah watched the news coverage from her apartment, which had become both her refuge and her prison. The story was everywhere. Teacher helps violent criminal escape prison. Romance scam leads to jailbreak. Fugitive still at large after elaborate escape plan. Her name hadn't been released to the media yet, but that wouldn't last long. In small towns like Cedar Rapids, secrets had a short shelf life. Already, her neighbors were looking at her differently. The questioning glances, the whispered conversations that stopped when she approached. Sarah's principal, Mrs. Henderson, had called the morning after the arrest to inform her that she was being placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation. The conversation was brief, professional, and devastating. "I'm sorry, Sarah," Mrs. Henderson had said, and she genuinely sounded sorry. "You're a good teacher, but the school board has no choice. We have to think about the children, their safety, their parents' concerns." Sarah understood. She would have made the same decision if their roles were reversed. But understanding didn't make it hurt less. The legal consequences came in waves. Federal charges for aiding and abetting an escape. State charges for smuggling contraband into a correctional facility. The possibility of conspiracy charges if prosecutors decided she was more involved than she claimed. Sarah's attorney, a tired-looking public defender named David Kim, explained her options during their first meeting: plea deal or trial, cooperation with law enforcement, or fighting the charges. "The government wants Marcus Taylor more than they want you," he explained. "If you help them catch him, if you testify about his methods of manipulation, they'll likely offer you a reduced sentence, maybe probation, instead of prison time." Prison time. The words felt surreal. Sarah had never even had a detention in school. And now, lawyers were discussing whether she would serve her sentence in federal or state custody. "What if they never catch him?" Sarah asked. David Kim shrugged. "Then your cooperation becomes less valuable, and your sentence becomes longer." That night, Sarah sat in her kitchen and tried to process the complete destruction of her life. Her career was over. Her reputation was destroyed. Her savings account was being drained by legal fees. She faced possible imprisonment, and even if she avoided jail time, she would be a convicted felon for the rest of her life. All for a man who had never loved her. A man who was probably laughing about her naivety as he planned his next crime in some mountain hideaway. Sarah's sister Jessica drove up from Des Moines the next morning, arriving with suitcases and a determined expression. Jessica was 2 years younger but had always been the practical one. The sister who made sensible choices and avoided emotional decisions. "You're coming to stay with me," Jessica announced, not asking but telling. "You can't stay here, dealing with this alone." Sarah wanted to resist, to maintain some dignity, but she was too exhausted to argue. She packed a bag with the few belongings that still felt like hers, and followed her sister to the car, as they drove through the Iowa countryside. Jessica broke the silence with the question Sarah had been dreading. "How did this happen, Sarah? How did you not see what he was?" It was a fair question, one Sarah had been asking herself constantly. How had she, an educated woman with advanced degrees, been so thoroughly deceived? He became what I needed him to be, Sarah said finally. I was lonely, and he made me feel special. I was bored, and he made life exciting. I was safe, and he made me feel alive. But didn't you question anything? The stories that didn't add up. The things that seemed too good to be true. Sarah stared out the window at farmhouses and silos, the familiar landscape of her childhood. I questioned things. But then, I'd talk myself out of the questions. I'd tell myself I was being paranoid, or untrusting, or that love meant accepting someone completely. The truth was more complicated than that. Sarah had seen red flags, inconsistencies in Marcus's stories, his reluctance to discuss his past, the way he deflected certain questions. But she had actively chosen to ignore them because the alternative was losing the most intense relationship of her life. Love, she realized, could be a form of willful blindness. Over the following weeks, as the media attention intensified and the legal proceedings ground forward, Sarah began to understand the full scope of Marcus's manipulation. The FBI shared details of his previous relationships, his methods of identifying and exploiting vulnerable women. Marcus targeted women who were isolated, women with stable jobs and clean records, women who were hungry for excitement but too sheltered. To recognize danger, he studied their social media profiles, their dating history, their psychological vulnerabilities. Sarah fit his profile perfectly: single, financially stable, emotionally starved, and naive about the criminal world. She had been selected as carefully as a surgeon selects instruments. The realization was simultaneously humiliating and liberating. Humiliating because it confirmed how easily she had been manipulated. Liberating because it meant the fault wasn't entirely hers, she had been the victim of a sophisticated predator. 6 weeks after the escape, Marcus was captured in a small town outside Phoenix, Arizona. He'd been working construction under a false name, saving money for the next phase of his plan. A routine traffic stop had led to his identification and arrest. Sarah watched his perp walk on the evening news. Seeing him in handcuffs and orange jumpsuit, the man on screen looked different from the Marcus she remembered. Harder, meaner, his charm replaced by sullen defiance. During his interrogation, Marcus showed no remorse for his actions or their consequences. When asked about Sarah, he shrugged and said, she knew what she was getting into. It was a lie. Sarah had known nothing, but it revealed Marcus's complete lack of empathy or accountability. To him, she had never been a person deserving of respect or honesty. She had been a tool, used and discarded without thought. Sarah's plea agreement was finalized a month later. In exchange for her cooperation and testimony, she received 2 years of probation, 500 hours of community service, and a felony record. That would follow her forever. She couldn't teach again. No school district would hire a convicted felon. She couldn't work with children in any capacity. Many employers wouldn't hire her at all once they ran a background check. But Sarah was alive, and she was free. She hadn't become another casualty of Marcus's manipulations, another woman destroyed by his calculated cruelty. Jessica helped her find work at a non-profit organization that assisted ex-offenders with job placement and life skills. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. She was now helping people like Marcus reintegrate into society. But she found purpose in the work. Using her experience to help others avoid the mistakes she had made, Sarah began speaking at workshops about romance scams and manipulation tactics. She shared her story with law enforcement agencies, helping them understand how intelligent women could be so thoroughly deceived. I thought love meant trusting completely, she would tell audiences. Thought questioning someone's stories meant I didn't believe in them. I confused blind faith with deep love. Her message was simple but powerful. Real love doesn't require you to ignore red flags or abandon your judgment. Real love doesn't ask you to break laws or compromise your values. Real love doesn't turn you into someone you don't recognize. 2 years after Marcus's recapture, Sarah received an unexpected phone call. It was Detective Walsh, the woman who had first questioned her about the escape. I wanted you to know, the detective said. Marcus is being transferred to a maximum security federal facility. No contact with the outside world. No visits, no letters, no phone calls. He'll never be able to manipulate another woman again. Sarah felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. Relief that Marcus could no longer hurt anyone else. Sadness for the women who had come before her, and for the woman she used to be, the trusting teacher who believed in fairy tale endings. There's something else, Detective Walsh continued. We found letters in his cell, dozens of them. He was already working on his next target, a nurse in Phoenix who had been writing to him since his arrest. Even behind bars, even facing life in prison, Marcus had been planning his next manipulation. It confirmed what Sarah had come to understand. Predators like Marcus never changed. They only got better at hiding their true nature. Sarah's probation ended on a cold Tuesday morning in February, exactly 3 years after she had first smuggled contraband into Millbrook Correctional Facility. She walked out of the courthouse, a free woman. But freedom felt different than it had before. Marcus entered her life. She was stronger now, but also more cautious. Wiser, but less trusting. She had learned to listen to her instincts instead of silencing them with romantic fantasies. At 31, Sarah was building a new life from the ruins of her old one. She had a small apartment in Des Moines, a job she found meaningful, and a growing network of friends who knew her story and accepted her anyway. She was dating again, cautiously, taking things slowly. The man she was seeing, Robert, was a social worker who understood trauma and didn't pressure her to move faster than she was comfortable with. How do you know when to trust someone? She had asked him during one of their early conversations. You don't, he replied honestly. Trust is always a risk. But you can learn to take calculated risks instead of blind leaps. It was good advice. Sarah was learning to ask questions without apologizing for them, to verify stories instead of accepting them on faith, to maintain her independence instead of losing herself in someone else's dreams. The nightmares had mostly stopped. The panic attacks were rare now. The shame, while still present, no longer controlled her daily life. Sarah had learned that healing wasn't about forgetting what happened or pretending it didn't matter. Healing was about integrating the experience into her life story without letting it define her completely. She still received occasional messages from other women who had been victimized by romance scammers. They found her through her speaking engagements or through victim advocacy websites. Sarah always responded, sharing her experience and offering support. It's not your fault, she would tell them. Smart people get scammed, good people get manipulated. It doesn't say anything about your worth or your judgment. It says something about the predator who targeted you. 5 years later, Sarah was invited to speak at a national conference on romance fraud. She stood at the podium, looking out at an audience of law enforcement officers, victim advocates, and survivors like herself. I thought I was helping the man I loved, she began. I thought I was part of a beautiful love story with a happy ending. I had no idea I was being cast as a supporting character in someone else's crime drama. The audience was quiet, attentive. Sarah had learned to tell her story without shame, to use her experience as a teaching tool rather than a source of embarrassment. Marcus Taylor taught me something valuable, though he never intended to, she continued. He taught me the difference between love and manipulation. Love builds you up and helps you become your best self. Manipulation tears you down and makes you someone you don't recognize. Love respects your boundaries and your judgment. Manipulation asks you to ignore your instincts and abandon your values. Love is patient and can wait for trust to develop naturally. Manipulation is urgent and pressures you to act before you've had time to think. Sarah's voice grew stronger as she reached the heart of her message. If someone claims to love you but asks you to break laws, hurt others, or compromise your integrity, that's not love. That's manipulation, and you deserve better. The applause was warm and sustained. Afterward, several people approached Sarah to share their own stories or to thank her for her courage in speaking publicly about such a painful experience. That night, in her hotel room, Sarah reflected on how far she had come from the naive teacher who had fallen for Marcus's lies. She wasn't the same person anymore. She was stronger, wiser, more resilient. She had paid a terrible price for those lessons, but she had survived. More than survived, she had found a way to transform her pain into purpose, her experience into advocacy. Sarah pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found Jessica's number. Her sister had been her anchor during the darkest period of her life, never judging, always supporting. "How did the speech go?" Jessica asked when she picked up. "Good," Sarah said. "Really good. I think I helped some people tonight. I'm proud of you," Jessica said, and Sarah could hear the smile in her voice. "You've turned something horrible into something meaningful." As Sarah prepared for bed, she thought about the woman she used to be. The woman who had believed that love meant never asking questions, never doubting, never protecting herself. That woman was gone, but Sarah didn't mourn her loss anymore. In her place stood someone stronger. Someone who understood that real love didn't require her to sacrifice her judgment or her safety. Someone who knew that the most important love of all was the love she had for herself, the love that would never again allow her to betray her own values for the promise of someone else's affection. The last lesson Marcus had taught her, though again unintentionally, was perhaps the most valuable. She was worth more than any relationship that required her to become less than who she was. And that lesson, Sarah knew, would protect her for the rest of her life. The end of this story touched you. Please share it with someone who might need to hear it. Love should never ask you to compromise your values or ignore your instincts. Trust is earned, not demanded. And remember, you are worth more than any relationship that requires you to become less than who you are. Have you ever found yourself ignoring red flags for love? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's continue this important conversation about recognizing manipulation and protecting ourselves while still remaining open to genuine connection.